Catherine Hartwell had learned that pride was both a woman's greatest weapon and her heaviest burden. At 49, she carried herself with the bearing of someone who had once commanded respect in drawing rooms and social gatherings, though those days felt like borrowed memories from another woman's life. The small homestead she now called her own set like a defiant speck against the red immensity of the South Australian desert, 30 miles from the nearest neighbor and a lifetime away from the grand station house where she had once presided as Mrs. Theodore Hartwell, wife of one of the colony's most powerful cattlemen. The divorce had been a scandalous affair that had tongued every parlor from Adelaide to Alice Springs. Theodore had made certain of that, ensuring her reputation crumbled as thoroughly as a marriage. A woman who abandons her husband's bed abandons a place in civilized society, the newspapers had proclaimed, though they had been notably silent about Theodore's own indiscretions with the housemaids and his frequent disappearances to the gambling houses of the port cities. Now, as twilight painted the Spinifex grass in shades of amber and gold, Catherine stood on her modest veranda, watching the sun surrender to the western horizon. Her hands, once soft and pampered, bore the honest calluses of a woman who had learned to split kindling and mend fences. Her dark hair, streaked with premature silver, was pinned back practically rather than fashionably, and her simple cotton dress spoke of function over form. She was reaching for the hurricane lamp when the sound reached her. Hoofbeats, steady and deliberate, cutting through the evening stillness like a blade through silk. Catherine's breath caught. Visitors were rare in this forgotten corner of creation, and those who came usually brought news she would rather not hear. Theodore's solicitors, perhaps, or worse still, Theodore himself, come to remind her that even in exile, his shadow could reach her. The rider emerged from the gathering dusk like a spectre materialized from the desert itself. He set his horse with the easy confidence of a man born to the saddle, his wide-brimmed hat casting his face in impenetrable shadow. A long coat, dusty from travel, hung loose about his frame, and something in his bearing spoke of danger held in careful check. Catherine's hand moved instinctively to the rifle mounted beside her door, but she did not take it down. Not yet. Instead, she stepped forward, her chin raised in a gesture of defiance that had become as natural to her as breathing. "You on private land, stranger," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the still air. "State your business or move along." The rider drew rein some 20 paces from a veranda, close enough for her to see the glint of steel at his hip and the hard lines of a face weathered by sun and circumstance. When he spoke, his voice was low and measured, with the careful cadence of a man who chose his words as precisely as he chose his targets. "Mrs. Catherine Hartwell," he said, and it was not a question. The use of her married name sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cooling desert air. "I am Miss Morrison now," she replied, reclaiming the name of her girlhood with deliberate emphasis. "And you have not answered my question." A smile ghosted across the stranger's features, though there was little humor in it. "John Mackenzie," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been courtesy in another man. "And I'm afraid your business is with me now, Miss Morrison." Before Catherine could react, before she could even begin to understand the threat implicit in his words, John Mackenzie was moving. He swung down from his horse with fluid grace and covered the distance between them in 3 swift strides. His hand closed over her wrist with surprising gentleness, though his grip was implacable as iron. "What do you think you?" Catherine began, but her words died as she found herself looking up into eyes the color of storm clouds, gray-blue and infinitely deep. "I'm truly sorry for this, Catherine," he said, and there was something in his voice, regret, perhaps, or weariness that went deeper than mere physical fatigue. "But I need you to come with me." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Catherine felt her knees threaten to buckle, but she locked them through sheer force of will. "You're mad if you think I'll go anywhere with you. I don't care what Theodore is paying you." "This isn't about payment," John interrupted, his voice soft but carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "And it's not about what you think it's about. But I give you my word, my sacred word, that no harm will come to you while you are under my protection." Protection. The word struck Catherine as absurd, given the circumstances, but something in his manner stayed the scream that had been building in her throat. This was not the crude brutality she might have expected from a hired ruffian. This was something else entirely, something more complex and infinitely more dangerous. "You're taking me against my will," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "That hardly sounds like protection to me." John's hand tightened fractionally on her wrist, and she felt the calluses on his palm, the sure grip of a man accustomed to handling both horses and weapons with equal skill. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "protection doesn't look the way we expect it to." As if in a dream, Catherine found herself being led away from the safety of a little homestead. John's movements were economical and purposeful as he gathered a few supplies from his saddlebags: rope, a blanket, provisions for travel. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes, stood patient as carved stone. The sun had nearly set now, painting the western sky in violent shades of crimson and gold. John led Catherine to an ancient coolibah tree that stood sentinel some 100 yards from the house, its gnarled trunk speaking of decades weathering the desert's moods. "Sit," he instructed, his voice still carrying that strange gentleness. "Please." Catherine wanted to run, wanted to fight, wanted to rage against the injustice of it all. Instead, she found herself sinking down against the tree's rough bark, her legs finally betraying the composure she had fought so hard to maintain. John worked with practiced efficiency, securing her wrists with rope that was strong but not cruelly tight. His fingers brushed her skin as he checked the bonds, and she was startled to find them warm, almost tender in their touch. "Why?" she whispered, the word torn from her throat like a confession. John paused in his work, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers in the fading light. For a moment, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or an acknowledgement of shared pain. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "the only way to save someone is to take them from everything they think they know." As the first stars began to prick the darkening sky, John settled himself a respectful distance away, his back against another tree, his rifle across his knees. The night sounds of the desert began to assert themselves. The distant call of a nightjar, the rustle of small creatures in the scrub, the whisper of wind through the grass. "Don't be afraid, Catherine," John said, his voice carrying clearly through the still air. "I know how this looks. I know what you must think of me. But I swear to you, on everything I hold sacred, that you are safer with me tonight than you have been in months." Catherine stared at him across the small space that separated them, her mind reeling with questions and possibilities. Who was this man who spoke her name with such familiarity? What did he want? And why? God help her. Did some part of her believe him when he said she was safe? The desert night settled around them like a blanket woven from starlight and shadow, and Catherine Morrison, who had once been Catherine Hartwell, who had learned to survive in a world that had no use for divorced women, found herself at the beginning of a journey that would test everything she thought she knew about trust, redemption, and the strange ways that salvation sometimes arrived. If you've ever found yourself rebuilding from ruins, or if you believe in second chances even in the harshest corners of the world, subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Chapter 1. The Bandit and the Ex-Wife. John Mackenzie was already awake, crouched by a small, smokeless fire, brewing tea in a blackened billy. He had removed his hat, revealing dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and in the morning light, Catherine could see that he was perhaps 45, with the lean build of a man who lived by his wits and his gun. "Good morning," he said without looking up from the fire. "I trust you slept as well as could be expected under the circumstances." Catherine tested her bonds and found them unchanged, secure but not painfully tight. Her wrists were merely stiff, not cut or chafed. "If by well, you mean not at all, then yes, I suppose I did." A smile tugged at the corner of John's mouth. "Sarcasm, Catherine, at this hour of the morning? I'm impressed." "Don't you dare use my Christian name as though we were intimates," Catherine snapped, though there was less venom in it than she might have intended. The smell of the tea was making her stomach growl, and she realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. John looked up then, his storm-gray eyes meeting hers with an expression that might have been amusement. "Would you prefer I address you as Mrs. Hartwell? Or perhaps Miss Morrison? Though given our current arrangement, formality seems a bit redundant." "Our arrangement?" Catherine's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain control. Is that what you call kidnapping? An arrangement? I call it necessity. John poured tea into 2 enamel cups, the liquid steaming in the cool morning air. And before you work yourself into a state, you should know that I have no intention of harming you. Quite the opposite. In fact, he rose and approached her, offering one of the cups. Catherine stared at it suspiciously. It's not poisoned, John said dryly. If I wanted you unconscious, there are far more efficient methods than tea. Despite herself, Catherine found the corners of her mouth twitching. How reassuring. The kidnapper has standards. I prefer to think of myself as having evolved beyond the crude methods of my early associates. John settled back down across from her, close enough that she could accept the cup without him having to untie her wrists entirely. A man learns refinement, even in disreputable circumstances. Catherine took a cautious sip of the tea and found it strong and welcome, flavored with leaves that spoke of civilization and normalcy in this most abnormal of situations. Associates, she repeated. You speak as though kidnapping were a business venture. In a manner of speaking, it is. John's voice carried a note of something that might have been regret, though I confess this particular venture has already deviated considerably from my original plan. And what was your original plan, Mr. Mackenzie? Catherine asked, surprised by her own boldness. Or should I call you by whatever alias you're currently favoring? John's laugh was low and genuinely amused. John Mackenzie is my own name, though I grant you've been attached to wanted posters in 3 colonies. As for my plan, he paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her suddenly conscious of a disheveled appearance. I had intended to use you as leverage against your former husband. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. Theodore, she breathed, the name tasting of ashes in her mouth. The same? It seems Mr. Hartwell has made himself some rather dangerous enemies in his business dealings. Men who are considerably less refined in their methods than I. John's voice was carefully neutral, but Catherine caught the undertone of distaste. They hired me to acquire something that would encourage his cooperation in a certain matter. And you thought taking his ex-wife would accomplish that? Catherine's laugh was bitter as alkali water. Mr. Mackenzie, if that was your plan, then I'm afraid someone has gravely misinformed you about the state of my marriage. John frowned, the first crack in his composed facade. He divorced you for adultery, according to the newspaper accounts. Surely there must be some lingering attachment. He divorced me for refusing to look the other way while he squandered our fortune on cards and courtesans. Catherine interrupted, her voice sharp with old pain. The adultery charges were convenient fiction to ensure I left with nothing but the clothes on my back and the small inheritance from my father that the law couldn't touch. She saw something shift in John's expression, a calculation being rapidly revised. You're telling me that Theodore Hartwell feels no protective instinct toward you whatsoever. Mr. Hartwell would be more likely to send you a thank you note than a ransom, Catherine said with dry humor that didn't quite mask the hurt beneath. You've kidnapped a woman with less value to him than his prize breeding bull. For a long moment, John stared at her, and Catherine could practically see the wheels turning behind those storm gray eyes. Then, to her complete amazement, he began to laugh, a rich, rueful sound that transformed his entire face. Well, he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, this is certainly a first. I've been outmaneuvered by a woman I've never met. Betrayed by information I was fool enough to trust, and now I find myself in possession of the one person in South Australia who is absolutely worthless as a bargaining chip. Despite everything, the rope around her wrists, the precariousness of her situation, the very real danger she was undoubtedly in, Catherine found herself smiling. Welcome to my world, Mr. Mackenzie. Worthlessness is something of a specialty of mine these days. John shook his head, still chuckling. Oh, Catherine Morrison, he said, her maiden name rolling off his tongue with surprising naturalness. I suspect you're many things, but worthless isn't one of them. Something in his tone made Catherine's breath catch. There was a warmth there, an appreciation that went beyond mere gallantry. When was the last time a man had looked at her as though she were truly worth seeing? So what happens now? She asked, working to keep her voice steady. "If I'm useless for your purposes, surely you'll simply let me go." John's expression grew serious again. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. The men who hire me aren't the sort to accept failure graciously. If they discover I've been played for a fool, they'll likely take out their disappointment on both of us." "Both of us? You think they'll simply let you return to your peaceful exile, knowing what you know about their business? Catherine, these men have killed for considerably smaller inconveniences." The weight of her situation began to settle on Catherine like dust from a distant storm. "So what are you suggesting?" John was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of their fire. When he looked up, his eyes held a resolve that was somehow both comforting and terrifying. "I'm suggesting," he said carefully, "that we may need to disappear together, at least until I can figure out how to extract us both from this mess with our skins intact." Catherine stared at him, this man who had abducted her and was now, apparently, offering to protect her from consequences he had inadvertently created. "You asking me to trust you?" "I'm asking you to trust me," John confirmed. "And I know how that must sound, given our introduction." "It sounds insane," Catherine said flatly. "It sounds like the ravings of a madman or a confidence trickster of the most accomplished sort." "Yes," John agreed. "It rather does, doesn't it?" They looked at each other across the small space that separated them, captor and captive, two people whose lives had become entangled by circumstances neither had anticipated. The morning sun was climbing higher now, promising another day of brutal heat, and somewhere in the distance, Catherine could hear the call of crows, harbingers of change in the ancient law of the desert. "If I were to agree to this madness," Catherine said slowly, "what would it entail?" John's smile was sharp as a blade. "Well, for starters, it would require you to become someone else entirely. Catherine Morrison is about to disappear as completely as Catherine Hartwell did after her divorce. And who would I become in her place?" "That," John said, rising to kick dirt over the fire, "would be up to you. The desert is full of possibilities for those brave enough to embrace them." As John began to break camp with the efficient movements of a man long accustomed to traveling light, Catherine found herself considering options she would never have imagined 24 hours ago. The woman who had awakened that morning was not the same one who had been taken from her homestead the evening before, and she was beginning to suspect that the changes were only just beginning. "Mr. Mackenzie," she called as he loaded his saddlebags. "John," he corrected without looking up. "If we are to be partners in this venture, we might as well dispense with the formalities." "John, then..." The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that made her pulse quicken. "Before I agree to anything, I need to know something." He paused in his work and looked at her expectantly. "Yesterday, when you took me," Catherine said, choosing her words carefully, "you said I was safer with you than I had been in months. What did you mean by that?" John's expression grew grave. "I meant that Theodore Hartwell has made enemies who would use any weapon that came to hand, Catherine, including his ex-wife, if they thought it would cause him pain, inconvenience." "But you just said..." "I said he wouldn't pay a ransom for you. That doesn't mean he wouldn't suffer to see you harmed." John's voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath the softness, and men like the ones who hired me don't draw such fine distinctions. They would have come for you eventually, with or without my involvement. The words settled over Catherine like a shroud. She had thought herself safely forgotten in a desert exile, but apparently the past had a longer reach than she had imagined. "So you see," John continued, "in a very real sense, taking you from your homestead may have saved your life. By endangering it in an entirely different way," Catherine pointed out. "True." John's smile was rueful. "But at least this danger comes with someone committed to keeping you alive." Catherine studied his face, searching for deception, for the calculating coldness you would have expected from a professional criminal. Instead, she found something that looked remarkably like sincerity, tempered by a weariness that spoke of experiences she could only guess at. "All right," she said finally. "All right, John Mackenzie. I'll trust you, at least for now, but I have conditions." John raised an eyebrow. "You're hardly in a position to negotiate," Catherine. "Aren't I?" Catherine's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. "You need me to cooperate if this mad scheme of yours is to work. And cooperation, I've learned it, is something that must be freely given to be of any value." "Fair enough. Name your conditions." "First, no more ropes. If we are to be partners, as you put it, then treat me as one." John nodded slowly. "Agreed, with the understanding that you won't attempt to escape or raise an alarm." "Where would I escape to? And who would I raise an alarm with?" Catherine's gesture took in the empty vastness surrounding them. "We are 30 miles from the nearest human habitation, and I have no horse, no supplies, and no knowledge of how to survive in this country on my own." "A fair point. What else?" "I want the truth. All of it. Who are these men you're so afraid of? What did they want from Theodore? And what exactly is your plan for keeping us both alive?" John was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the distant horizon. "The truth," he said finally, "is a dangerous commodity. Catherine, are you certain you want to bear that burden?" "I've been bearing the burden of lies and half-truth for years," Catherine replied steadily. "I think I can manage the weight of honesty for a change." "Very well." John moved toward her, drawing a knife from his boot. "The truth? Then, but first, let me free you from these bonds. If we are to be partners, you're right, we should start as equals." As the ropes fell away from her wrists, Catherine felt a surge of something that might have been hope. She was still in danger, still at the mercy of circumstances beyond her control. But for the first time in longer than she cared to remember, she felt like an active participant in her own fate rather than a victim of other people's choices. The sun climbed high into the crystal-clear sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wedge-tailed eagle rode the thermals with magnificent indifference to the small dramas being played out below. Catherine Morrison, who had once been Catherine Hartwell, stood up and brushed the dust from her skirts, ready to hear truths that might change everything she thought she knew about the world and her place in it. Chapter 2. In the stillness of the dusk. 3 days into their journey across the red heart of the continent, Catherine had learned that traveling with an outlaw was considerably more civilized than her previous experience with respectability. John Mackenzie, she discovered, was a man of unexpected contradictions. He could track water across seemingly barren landscape, could read weather patterns in the behavior of insects, and could prepare a meal from desert provisions that was both nourishing and surprisingly palatable. He was also, she was beginning to realize, haunted by ghosts that rode his shoulders as surely as she carried her own. They had made camp in the shelter of a rock formation that thrust up from the red earth like the spine of some ancient, sleeping creature. The horses. John had appropriated a sturdy mare from a cache he maintained somewhere in his network of hideouts, cropped contentedly at the sparse grass growing in the shadow of the rocks. Catherine sat on a blanket, watching John tend to their evening fire. His movements were economical in show, the result of years spent in places where a poorly built fire could mean the difference between life and death. The flames painted his weathered features in shifting patterns of light and shadow, and she found herself wondering about the choices that had brought him to this life. "You're staring," John observed without looking up from his work. "I'm thinking," Catherine corrected. "There's a difference. Dangerous habit, thinking. I've known it to get a man into considerable trouble." Catherine smiled despite herself. "Is that what happened to you? Too much thinking?" John glanced up, his storm-gray eyes catching the firelight. "Actually, it was too little thinking that started my troubles. The thinking came later, when it was too late to do much good." "Tell me," Catherine said quietly. For a long moment, John continued working with the fire, arranging the coals with a stick to ensure even heat. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, as though he were relating events that had happened to someone else entirely. "I was a stockman once. A good one, or so I thought. Had a way with horses and cattle. Could read country like other men read books." He paused, stirring the coals. "Worked for a station owner up in Queensland, man named Morrison." Catherine's breath caught. "Morrison? No relation, I'd guess, unless you've got family scattered across the Northern Territories. This Morrison was a hard man, but fair in his way. until his son came back from England with ideas about modernizing the operation. John's voice carried a bitterness that spoke of old wounds still tender to the touch. Young Morrison had been to university, you see, learned all about scientific management and efficiency, decided that men like me, men who'd spent their lives learning the country, were obsolete. What happened? What always happens when book learning meets experience in open country. The young fool made decisions that cost lives. John's hand stilled on the stick he'd been using to tend the fire. A mob of cattle caught in flood country because he wouldn't listen to his drovers about weather signs. 3 men died trying to get them out. Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. You were one of the drovers. I was the head stockman. It was my responsibility to get those men out alive. John's voice was barely above a whisper. I failed. It wasn't your fault if Morrison's son ignored your advice. Wasn't it? John looked at her then, and Catherine saw pain in his eyes that went deeper than the bone. I could have refused to follow his orders. Could have taken the men and left the cattle to their fate. Should have, maybe, but I thought I was clever enough to say both. And Morrison blamed you for the deaths. Morrison was dead by then. Heart gave out when he heard about his son's latest folly. Young Morrison blamed me, certainly, had me arrested for negligence, though the charges didn't stick. But by the time I was cleared, word had spread. No station owner in Queensland would hire the stockman who'd cost Morrison his men. Catherine began to understand. So you turned to other means of making a living. Started with cattle duffing, John admitted. Figured if I couldn't work with honest cattle, I might as well work with stolen ones. From there it was a short step to other forms of irregular employment, including kidnapping. John's smile was bitter as wormwood. Among other things, I told myself it was just temporary, that I'd save enough money to start over somewhere else, maybe in the Americas or New Zealand. Told myself that for 15 years. The silence stretched between them, filled with the crack and whisper of the fire and the distant call of night birds. Catherine found herself seeing John Mackenzie in an entirely different light. Not as the cold professional she had initially imagined, but as a man who had made one wrong choice and found himself trapped by the consequences. What about you, Catherine? John asked suddenly. What choices led you to a divorce court in Adelaide? Catherine stiffened. That's rather personal, don't you think? We are sitting around a campfire in the middle of nowhere, on the run from men who would cheerfully kill us both, John pointed out. I think we've moved beyond the boundaries of polite society. Despite everything, Catherine found herself laughing. I suppose we have, at that. She was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames and seeing not the desert campfire but the grand pile of the Hartwell mansion, with its imported furniture and its atmosphere of genteel decay. I was 19 when I married Theodore, she said finally. Thought I was so worldly, so sophisticated. My father had died the year before, leaving me a modest inheritance and no male relatives to speak for me. Theodore was 43, wealthy, established. Everyone said it was a brilliant match. But it wasn't. Oh, it was brilliant enough, in its way. Theodore needed a wife to maintain his social position, and I needed security. It was a business arrangement dressed up in orange blossoms and silk. Catherine pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. The problem started almost immediately. Theodore had appetites that couldn't be satisfied by one woman, no matter how willing she might be to overlook his indiscretions for the sake of propriety. He was unfaithful, systematically, and expensive in his infidelities. By the time I realized how deeply in debt we were, Theodore had mortgaged everything that wasn't entailed, including my father's legacy. Catherine's voice grew hard. When I confronted him, tried to get him to exercise some restraint, he told me that wives were meant to be seen and not heard, particularly when their husband's business was concerned. John stirred the fire, sending sparks spiraling up into the night sky. I take it you disagreed with that assessment. Vigorously. Unfortunately, Theodore had friends in the banking community, men who were happy to help him access my inheritance in exchange for favorable business terms. By the time I understood what was happening, most of my father's money was gone. So you left him? I threatened to leave him. Theodore couldn't afford the scandal. He was negotiating some sort of partnership agreement that required him to appear financially stable and morally respectable. Catherine's laugh was bitter. So he divorced me first, claiming adultery I'd never committed, ensuring that I would be the pariah rather than him. And your family? Closed ranks around respectability. A divorced woman, particularly one divorced for adultery, was a social embarrassment they couldn't afford to acknowledge. Catherine's voice was steady, but John could hear the old pain beneath the composure. I became a person who had never existed, as far as polite society was concerned. Hence the exile to the desert. Hence the exile. The homestead was purchased with the remnants of my inheritance, the few assets Theodore couldn't touch legally. I told myself I was starting over, building a new life. Catherine looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Instead, I think I was just waiting. For what? I don't know. For something to change, I suppose. For some miracle that would restore my place in the world. She shook her head. Foolish. Really. The world doesn't work that way. Doesn't it? John's voice was thoughtful. Seems to me that something has changed. You're not the same woman who was taken from her homestead 3 days ago. Catherine considered this, surprised to realize he was right. The woman who had awakened that morning tied to a coolibah tree would never have engaged in this conversation, would never have found herself laughing with a man who had abducted her, would never have agreed to throw alone with an outlaw and a stranger. No, she said slowly. I don't suppose I am. Change is a choice. Catherine, it doesn't come from outside. It comes from deciding that who you are isn't necessarily who you have to be. Spoken like a man with experience in reinvention. John admitted, though I'll confess I haven't always chosen my changes wisely. They fell into comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The fire burned lower, casting longer shadows among the rocks, and the desert night settled around them with its ancient peace. Somewhere in the distance, a dingo called to its pack, the sound wild and lonely and free. John, Catherine said suddenly, when we were talking about your plan, about disappearing, you mentioned that I would need to become someone else entirely. That's right. What if I don't want to become someone else? What if I want to become who I really am for the first time? John looked at her across the dying fire, and Catherine saw understanding kindle in his eyes like a flame catching tinder. Then I'd say, he replied quietly, that you've already taken the first step. Chapter 3. Sunrise and Redemption. The next morning brought news that changed everything. John had ridden out at dawn to scout their back trail, leaving Catherine to tend the camp and the horses. He returned as the sun was climbing toward its zenith, his face grim with information she could tell she didn't want to hear. "We're being followed," he said without preamble, swinging down from his saddle. 3 riders, maybe 4, moving fast and reading sign like they know their business. Catherine felt her heart sink. The men who hired you. More likely bounty hunters. Word's gotten out that John Mackenzie has been seen in the area with a female companion. They are men who would kill their own mothers for the price on my head. How far behind us? Half a day, maybe less. They are pushing hard. John began breaking camp with efficient haste. We need to move, and we need to be clever about it. Clever how? John paused in rolling up his blankets, a smile ghosting across his features that was equal parts grim and inspired. How good are you at dying, Catherine Morrison? I beg your pardon. Because I think it's time for Catherine Morrison to have a tragic accident. A fatal encounter with the harsh realities of desert travel, witnessed by a grief-stricken companion who was powerless to save her. Catherine stared at him, understanding dawning like sunrise over the red plains. You want to fake my death. I want to eliminate Catherine Morrison as a factor in this hunt. Dead women tell no tales and pose no threat to anyone. John's eyes were bright with the light of inspiration. And grieving men are often careless with their guard, vulnerable to approach by sympathetic strangers. Sympathetic strangers. You'll need a new identity, Catherine. Someone with no connection to Catherine Morrison or Catherine Hartwell. Someone these bounty hunters have never heard of and wouldn't recognize. John's voice was warming to his theme. I'm thinking a widow, perhaps. Someone I encountered on the trail who took pity on a man who had just lost his traveling companion to snakebite or fever. Despite the danger of their situation, Catherine found herself intrigued by the audacity of the plan. And what happens to this grieving companion once has encountered the sympathetic widow? Why, he finds comfort in her company, of course. Perhaps even decides to escort her to safety, being a gentleman of the old school who wouldn't dream of leaving a lady alone in such dangerous country. Catherine couldn't help but smile. You're suggesting we travel together openly, in plain sight of anyone who might be looking for us. Sometimes the best place to hide is in full view. No one expects the hunted to walk boldly down the main street. John's expression grew serious, but it will require considerable acting ability on both our parts. Can you play the role of a grieving widow who has nothing to hide? Mr. Mackenzie, Catherine said, rising and brushing dust from her skirts. I've been playing roles my entire adult life. The dutiful daughter, the society wife, the shamed divorcee, the hermit exile. What's one more performance? Then we'd better get started. Our audience will be here before long, and first impressions are everything in this business. The next few hours pass in a flurry of activity that would have seemed absurd under any other circumstances. John chose a spot near a rocky outcrop where flash floods had carved a natural grave-like depression in the earth. With Catherine's help, he constructed what appeared to be a fresh burial mound, complete with a crude wooden cross fashioned from fallen branches. Catherine contributed her spare dress and undergarments to the deception, burying them beneath the stones in a way that suggested a hasty interment performed by someone with limited tools and overwhelming grief. John even went so far as to scatter some of his own blood, drawn from a shallow cut on his palm, around the grave site to suggest a struggle or accident. What's my name? Catherine asked as they put the finishing touches on their grim theater. What would you like it to be? Catherine considered this, realizing that for the first time in her adult life, she had the opportunity to choose her own identity completely. Elizabeth, she said finally. Elizabeth Thornton, a widow from Adelaide, traveling to visit family in Alice Springs. And how did you come to be alone in the desert, Mrs. Thornton? My husband died 6 months ago. I sold our small property and hired a guide to take me north, but he abandoned me 3 days ago when our water ran low. Took the pack horses and most of the supplies. Catherine's voice took on a quaver of authentic distress. I've been walking ever since, following the track and praying for rescue. John nodded approvingly. Excellent. Desperate enough to be believable, but not so tragic as to be suspicious. And it explains why you have so few possessions. They had barely finished their preparations when the dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon, 3 riders pushing their mounts hard across the desert floor. John immediately assumed the posture of a man deep in grief, kneeling beside the makeshift grave with his hat in his hands. Catherine retreated to a position some distance away, where she began the careful process of transforming herself from Catherine Morrison into Elizabeth Thornton. She loosened her hair from its practical pins, allowing it to fall in wind-tangled waves around her shoulders. She rubbed dust into her skin and clothing, creating the appearance of someone who had been traveling rough for days. Most importantly, she composed her features into the expression of a woman who had found unexpected hope in a hopeless situation. The bounty hunters, for that's clearly what they were, approached with the wariness of men accustomed to danger. Their leader was a big, florid man, with the look of an ex-policeman about him. The other 2 were younger, harder, with the cold eyes of men who killed for money and slept soundly afterward. You there, the leader called when they were still 20 yards away. Stand up slow and keep your hands where we can see them. John rose with the deliberate movements of a man lost in sorrow, his rifle deliberately visible but pointed toward the ground. Gentlemen, he said, his voice hoarse with what sounded like genuine emotion. I'm afraid you find me at a most difficult time. The leader's eyes flicked to the grave, then to Catherine, who had begun walking toward them with the hesitant steps of someone desperate for human contact. Oh, thank God, she called, her voice carrying clearly across the still air. "Please, are you traveling toward civilization? I've been walking for 3 days." "Hold it right there, lady," the leader snapped, his hand moving to his pistol. "Nobody moves until we sort out what's what here." John stepped forward, his posture protective. "There's no need to frighten the lady, friend. She's been through enough hardship already. Have you now?" The leader's eyes were suspicious as they studied Catherine's disheveled appearance. "And who might you be, Miss?" "Mrs. Thornton," Catherine replied, allowing a tremor to enter her voice. "Elizabeth Thornton. I was traveling to Alice Springs when my guide abandoned me. This gentleman," she gestured toward John, "found me yesterday, nearly dead from thirst." "Did he now?" The second bounty hunter spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a Queensland accent thick as treacle. "And what's your name, mate?" John straightened, meeting the man's gaze directly. "James Mitchell. I was traveling with my wife when she took ill." His voice broke convincingly. "Fever took her 2 days ago. I've been trying to find the courage to leave her." The three bounty hunters exchanged glances, clearly recalculating. Their quarry was supposed to be a dangerous outlaw traveling with a kidnapped woman, not a grieving widower and a stranded traveler who had found each other in the vastness. "We are looking for a man," the leader said slowly. "John Mackenzie, wanted for robbery and kidnapping. You haven't seen anyone matching that description, have you?" Catherine saw John's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady when he replied. "Can't say I have, friend, though I'll admit I haven't been paying much attention to other travelers these past few days." "Course not," the Queensland accent agreed. "Man's got other things on his mind at a time like this." Catherine could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. These men were professionals. They hadn't survived in their dangerous occupation by being easily fooled. If they suspected deception, "Please," she said, stepping forward with the desperation of someone who saw salvation slipping away. "If you're heading toward town, could you spare some water? Or perhaps I could travel with you. I have some money. Not much, but I could pay for your protection." The leader studied her face, searching for deception, for any sign that she was not what she appeared to be. Catherine met his gaze with the open desperation of a woman who had been abandoned to die in the desert, and gradually she saw his suspicion give way to something like pity. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose we can spare some water. Can't leave a lady to die of thirst, no matter what our business might be." "Thank you," Catherine breathed, allowing tears of relief to well in her eyes. "Oh, thank you so much." As the bounty hunters shared their water and discussed the best route to Alice Springs, Catherine caught John's eye across the small group. For just a moment, she saw admiration there, and something else, a warmth that had nothing to do with their shared deception and everything to do with the woman she was revealing herself to be under pressure. Elizabeth Thornton, she realized, was someone she could learn to like. The bounty hunters departed an hour later, convinced that they were pursuing a false trail and eager to pick up John Mackenzie's track elsewhere. Catherine and John waited until the dust of their passage had disappeared completely before dropping their assumed roles. "That," John said with genuine admiration, "was a masterful performance." "I had an excellent teacher," Catherine replied, though she was surprised by how natural the deception had felt, "and an excellent script. Elizabeth Thornton suits you. She's someone with backbone, someone who takes charge of her own destiny." Catherine considered this. "Yes, I rather think she is." They spent the rest of the day perfecting their new identities and preparing for the next phase of their journey. As they worked, Catherine found herself studying John with new eyes. She had seen him under pressure now, had watched him think on his feet and adapt to changing circumstances with the skill of a natural survivor. More than that, she had seen the way he looked at her, not as a burden to be managed or a tool to be used, but as a partner whose opinions mattered and whose welfare was genuinely important to him. It was a revelation after years of being treated as either a decorative object or an embarrassing inconvenience. That evening, As they sat by their carefully constructed fire, Catherine found herself asking the question that had been building in her mind all day. "John," she said, "when this is over, when we've evaded these bounty hunters and sorted out the mess with your former employers, what then?" John was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I don't know," he said finally. "I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stop." "Maybe that's a problem. Maybe you've been running from something instead of toward something. And what would you suggest I run toward?" Catherine looked at him across the fire, this man who had taken her from everything familiar and, in doing so, had somehow given her the chance to discover who she really was. "A second chance," she said quietly. "A chance to be the man you were meant to be before circumstances forced you to become someone else." "And what about you, Elizabeth Thornton? What are you running toward?" Catherine smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a smile of genuine hope. "I'm running toward finding out who I am when I'm not trying to be who everyone else expects me to be." The fire crackled between them, and somewhere in the distance, night birds called to each other across the vast spaces of the continent. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new decisions that could determine whether they lived or died. But tonight, for the first time in longer than either could remember, both Catherine and John felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. 2 weeks had passed since Catherine Morrison had died beside a rocky outcrop in the South Australian desert, and Elizabeth Thornton was discovering that she quite liked being alive. The transformation had been so complete that sometimes Catherine had to remind herself that Elizabeth was merely a role she was playing. But as they made their way north through the red heart of the continent, she began to realize that Elizabeth Thornton was less a disguise than a revelation. She was a woman Catherine had always been beneath the layers of expectation and propriety. They had reached the small township of Mary, where the railway ended and the real outback began. It was a rough place, populated by drovers, prospectors, and others who had found reasons to seek the far edges of civilization. Hey, a widow traveling with a gentleman protector raised no eyebrows, and Elizabeth Thornton could move freely without fear of recognition. John had registered them at the modest boarding house as Mr. Mitchell and Mrs. Thornton, maintaining the fiction of their chance meeting in the desert. To the casual observer, they appeared to be exactly what they claimed. 2 people who had found comfort in each other's company after tragedy had altered their lives. The reality, Catherine was beginning to realize, was not so very different from the fiction. "You're thinking again," John observed as they sat on the boarding house veranda, watching the evening traffic on the dusty main street. "Dangerous habit," Catherine replied, echoing his earlier words. "Indeed. What particular dangers are you contemplating this evening?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, watching a team of camels being led through town by the Afghan handler. The sight should have seemed exotic, alien, but after 2 weeks in the desert, it seemed perfectly natural. Just another thread in the complex tapestry of outback life. "I was thinking about the woman I used to be," she said finally. "Catherine Hartwell, with her fine dresses and a place in society. She seems like someone I knew a very long time ago." "Do you miss her?" "I miss the security she represented. The certainty of knowing her place in the world, even if that place was ultimately unsatisfying." Catherine turned to look at John, studying his profile in the lamplight that spilled from the boarding house windows. "But I don't think I could go back to being her, even if circumstances allowed it." And Catherine Morrison, the exile, the hermit of a homestead. She was just waiting, existing without living, if that makes any sense. Catherine shook her head. Elizabeth Thornton, on the other hand, Elizabeth Thornton chooses her own path. Exactly. Catherine smiled, but it faded quickly as a new thought occurred to her. "John, what happens when we reach Alice Springs? Your plan was to disappear, to start over somewhere else. Does that still hold true?" John's expression grew thoughtful. "I suppose that depends on what we find when we get there. The men who hired me, they won't simply forget about their investment. Sooner or later, they'll want an accounting of what went wrong. And when they do, I'll have to convince them that their investment was a total loss. that John Mackenzie failed completely in his mission and disappeared into the desert, probably dead. John's smile was grim. It won't be an easy sell, but it's the only way to ensure your safety. Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. You're talking about leaving. I'm talking about protecting you. These aren't men who forgive failure. Catherine, if they connect you to what happened, if they realize that John Mackenzie didn't die in the desert, then we face them together. John turned to stare at her, clearly startled by the quiet conviction in her voice. Catherine, you don't understand what you're saying. These men are killers, and we are survivors. We've proven that over the past 2 weeks. Catherine leaned forward, her eyes intense in the lamplight. John, I've spent my entire adult life being protected by men who ultimately failed me or abandoned me when protection became inconvenient. I won't be protected anymore. I'll be a partner, or I'll be nothing at all. For a long moment, John studied her face, searching for doubt or fear or the feminine weakness he had been conditioned to expect. Instead, he found steel, not the brittle hardness of desperation, but the flexible strength of someone who had been tested and emerged unbroken. You realize what you're suggesting, he said quietly. I'm suggesting that Elizabeth Thornton face her problems head-on with a partner she trusts. Catherine's voice was steady, but John could hear the emotion beneath the words. I'm suggesting that two people who have found something worth preserving fight for it together. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of what had been growing between them through the long days of travel and the intimate evenings around their campfires. It was more than attraction, more than convenience or shared danger. It was recognition, the rare and precious understanding that comes when two souls discover they are not alone in the world. All right, John said finally. Together, then, but we do this properly, with planning and patience. No heroic gestures, no unnecessary risks. Agreed. So what do we know about these men? Who are they, and what did they want from Theodore? John was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of information that had cost him considerable effort to acquire. The leader is a man named Vincent Carstairs. He came up from Melbourne about 3 years ago with money to invest and political connections that opened doors throughout South Australia. On the surface, he's a legitimate businessman with interests in mining, shipping, and cattle. And beneath the surface, he's the kind of man who solves business disputes with dynamite and bullets. He's been systematically acquiring controlling interests in various enterprises, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through other means. Catherine felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. And Theodore, your former husband controls water rights along several major stock routes. Without access to those water sources, cattle movements become much more difficult and expensive. Carstairs wants those rights. But Theodore's financial difficulties, sure he would sell if the price were right. Apparently not. Theodore may be a fool with cards and women, but he understands the value of what he controls. He's been holding out for a higher price than Carstairs is willing to pay. So Carstairs decided to apply pressure. Exactly. And I was supposed to be that pressure. John's voice was bitter with self-recrimination. Take the ex-wife. Convince Theodore that worse things would happen if he didn't cooperate. Catherine began to understand the full implications of their situation. But now Carstairs knows his information was wrong. He knows that taking me would accomplish nothing. Which means he'll either abandon the scheme entirely or escalate to more direct methods. John's eyes were grave. And men like Carstairs rarely abandon profitable schemes. As if summoned by their conversation, trouble arrived with the dawn. Catherine was awakened by urgent knocking at her door, followed by John's voice, low but carrying a note of barely controlled urgency. Elizabeth, we need to leave. Now. She dressed quickly in the simple traveling clothes that had become her uniform, her mind already racing ahead to possibilities and preparations. When she emerged from her room, she found John waiting in the hallway, his face grim with news she could tell she didn't want to hear. What is it? 3 men rode in just after sunrise. They'd been asking questions about travelers. specifically about a woman matching your description and a man matching mine. Catherine felt her heart sink. Carstairs men, different ones. Professional killers, from the look of them, not bounty hunters. John's voice was tight with controlled tension. Words gotten out that John Mackenzie was seen alive in this area. They are not here to capture, they are here to eliminate loose ends. All the more reason to face this directly. If we keep running, we might live to see another sunrise. John's hand closed over her wrist. Not roughly, but with the desperate grip of a man trying to save someone he cared about. Catherine, these aren't men who can be reasoned with or outwitted. They kill for money, and they are very good at their work. For a moment, Catherine wavered. The sensible thing, the safe thing, would be to run, to disappear deep into the outback and hope that time and distance would eventually make them unimportant enough to ignore. But safety, she had learned, was often an illusion, and running had a way of becoming a permanent condition. "No," she said quietly. "No more running, John. Elizabeth Thornton doesn't run from her problems, and neither do I." Before John could protest, she was moving toward the stays, her spine straight and her chin raised in the gesture of defiance that had become as natural to her as breathing. Behind her, she heard John curse softly, then the sound of his footsteps following her down the narrow staircase. The three strangers were easy to spot in the boarding house dining room. They sat apart from the other guests, their eyes constantly moving, their hands never far from their weapons. The leader was a thin, sharp-featured man with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors. His companions were younger, harder, with the look of men who had learned violence as a trade and practiced it as an art. Catherine approached their table with the confident stride of a woman accustomed to command attention. She was aware of John behind her, his presence both comforting and concerning. She didn't want his protective instincts to complicate what she was about to attempt. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet dining room. "I understand you're looking for someone." The thin man looked up, his pale eyes studying Catherine with the cold calculation of a snake evaluating prey. "And you would be Elizabeth Thornton, and I believe you're looking for information about a man named John Mackenzie and a woman named Catherine Morrison." A murmur ran through the dining room, and Catherine was aware of other guests edging away from their table, sensing danger in the sudden tension that filled the air like smoke from a grass fire. "Interesting," the thin man said softly. "And what would you know about such people, Mrs. Thornton?" "I know that Catherine Morrison is dead," Catherine replied steadily. "Died of fever in the desert 2 weeks ago. I was there when it happened." "Were you indeed?" The thin man gestured to an empty chair. "Please, sit down. I think this conversation deserves a more intimate setting." Catherine sat, acutely aware of John taking a position where he could see both the room and the street outside. The thin man leaned forward, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "My name is Aldrich," he said conversationally. "I represent certain business interests that had dealings with Mr. Mackenzie. Unfortunately, those dealings did not conclude satisfactorily." "I see. And you think Catherine Morrison might have information relevant to those dealings?" "I think Catherine Morrison might have been an unwilling participant in Mr. Mackenzie's failure to fulfill his obligations." Aldrich's smile was cold as winter moonlight. "Dead women, as I'm sure you'll agree, make poor witnesses." Catherine felt the trap closing around them, but she pressed forward, knowing that retreat now would be fatal. "Then perhaps you should be speaking to Mr. Mackenzie directly. If we could find him." Unfortunately, Mr. Mackenzie seems to have disappeared as completely as Miss Morrison. Aldrich's eyes flicked to John, then back to Catherine. "Though I'm beginning to suspect that reports of both deaths may have been greatly exaggerated." The moment balanced on a knife's edge, and Catherine knew that the next few seconds would determine whether they lived or died. Around them, the dining room had gone completely silent, other guests sensing the deadly undercurrent of the conversation without understanding its specifics. "Mr. Aldrich," Catherine said quietly, "I think there may be some confusion about the nature of your business interests." "Oh!" You see, I happen to know that Vincent Carstairs is no longer interested in pursuing his original arrangement with Mr. Mackenzie. Aldrich went very still, his pale eyes narrowing to slits. You seem remarkably well informed for a widow who happened to encounter Mr. Mackenzie by chance in the desert. Information has a way of traveling in the outback, even to widows. Catherine's voice remained steady despite the racing of her heart. And the information I have is that Mr. Carstairs has found a more direct solution to his difficulties with Theodore Hartwell. She was gambling now, bluffing with information she didn't possess, hoping that a guess about Carstairs' impatience would prove accurate. The silence stretched between them like a rope under tension, ready to snap at the first sign of weakness. Finally, Aldrich smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. You are either very brave, Mrs. Thornton, or very foolish. Perhaps both. Perhaps, Catherine agreed, but I'm also very well connected. The information about Mr. Carstairs' new arrangements came from sources that would be inconvenienced if anything unfortunate were to happen to me. It was a complete fabrication, but Catherine delivered it with a conviction of absolute truth. She saw uncertainty flicker across Aldrich's features, the first crack in his professional composure. You're suggesting that your continued good health is a matter of interest to people more dangerous than myself. I'm suggesting that the world is full of unexpected connections, Mr. Aldrich, and that sometimes the wisest course is to accept that certain situations have resolved themselves naturally without the need for further intervention. Aldrich studied her face for a long moment, clearly weighing options and calculating risks. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his hand moving away from the weapon at his hip. Mrs. Thornton, he said softly, you are either the most persuasive liar I've ever encountered, or you're telling the truth in a way that makes continued pursuit of this matter inadvisable. I prefer to think of myself as someone who understands the value of accurate information and timely communication. Aldrich's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Indeed? Well, Mrs. Thornton, I believe our business here is concluded. Please give my regards to Mr. Mitchell, assuming he continues to exist under that name. With that, Aldrich rose from the table, his companions following suit. They moved toward the door with the unhurried pace of professionals who had completed their assignment, leaving Catherine sitting alone at the table with her heart hammering against her ribs. John appeared at her side the moment the three men disappeared through the doorway. Catherine, that was insane. She looked up at him, surprised to find herself smiling. Yes, I rather think it was, but it worked. How could you possibly know that Carstairs had found another solution? I couldn't, but men like Aldrich don't travel this far from civilization to eliminate loose ends unless those loose ends have become genuinely dangerous to their employers. If we were truly unimportant, they would have simply forgotten about us. John stared at her with a mixture of admiration and something that might have been love. Elizabeth Thornton, he said softly, you are a remarkable woman. No, Catherine replied, rising from the table and taking his arm. I'm simply a woman who has finally learned to trust herself. They left Mary that afternoon, ostensibly heading north toward Alice Springs, but actually turning west into country so remote that even the Aboriginal tribes visited it only when traveling between more hospitable regions. Here, in a landscape that seemed carved from raw sunlight and ancient stone, they made a camp that felt less like a temporary refuge and more like a homecoming. What happens now? Catherine asked as they sat by their fire on the first night in their new sanctuary. Now we decide who we want to be, John replied. James Mitchell and Elizabeth Thornton have no past to escape from, no reputation to maintain, no expectations to fulfill except the ones they choose for themselves. Catherine looked at him across the flames, this man who had taken her from one life and given her the chance to choose another. And what do James Mitchell and Elizabeth Thornton choose? John's smile was the first genuinely happy expression she had seen on his face since they had met. I think they choose each other, if Mrs. Thornton is amenable to the arrangement. Mrs. Thornton, Catherine said softly, has been waiting her entire life for such an arrangement. The desert night settled around them with its ancient peace, and somewhere in the vast silence that surrounded their small circle of firelight, Catherine Morrison finally, completely, ceased to exist. In a place sat a woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest courage was not in enduring what life gave you, but in choosing to take what life offered and making it your own. 6 months later, a small homestead appeared on the edge of the great western desert, built by a man and woman who had come from somewhere else and who asked nothing from the world except to be left alone to build something together. The nearest neighbors were 3 days' ride away, but those who encountered the couple spoke of their evident contentment, their obvious partnership, and the way they looked at each other as though they had discovered something precious that they had no intention of losing. Elizabeth Mitchell, for she had taken her husband's name in a ceremony conducted by a traveling preacher who asked no questions about their past, sometimes stood on a veranda in the evenings, watching the sun set over the red immensity that had become her world. In those moments, she remembered the woman she had been, but she felt no sadness for the life she had left behind. James Mitchell had kept his word. He had protected her, not by keeping her safe from danger, but by helping her discover that she was strong enough to face whatever dangers came. In return, she had given him something he had never expected to find, a reason to stop running and start building. The man who had once been John Mackenzie still lived within James Mitchell, just as the woman who had been Catherine Morrison lived within Elizabeth. But these were not secrets to be hidden or shames to be forgotten. They were simply chapters in a story that was still being written, by two people who had learned that the past need not define the future, and that love was not something that happened to you, but something you chose to create. As the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson on their first anniversary, Elizabeth Mitchell stood on a veranda and realized that she had never been happier in her life. The woman who had once been Catherine Morrison had spent years waiting for life to begin. Elizabeth Mitchell understood that life was not something that happened to you. It was something you made happen, one choice at a time, with courage and love and the willingness to trust that tomorrow might be better than today. Behind her, she heard James's footsteps on the wooden boards, felt his arm circle her waist as he joined her in watching the ancient ritual of sunset over their desert kingdom. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. Elizabeth leaned back against his chest, solid and reassuring and utterly hers. "Only one," she said. "What's that?" "I regret that it took me 49 years to realize that the only person who could save me was myself." James laughed, the sound rich with contentment. "And I regret that it took a failed kidnapping for me to understand that the thing I'd been running from was the possibility of being happy." They stood together as the stars began to appear in the vast dome of sky above them. Two people who had learned that redemption was not something granted by others but something you chose for yourself, and that love was not a reward for being perfect but a gift that imperfect people could give each other in the midst of an imperfect world. The desert night settled around them like a benediction, and in the distance, a dingo called to its pack, wild and free and unashamed of its place in the ancient order of things. If this story moves something inside you, a memory, a dream, a feeling of hope, leave a comment below and subscribe. There are many Outback tales waiting to be told, and yours might be one of them.